Good evening. So great to have you join us today. It is week 2 of our Privilege series, and we're so excited. And the feedback that we've been receiving from you guys has been amazing. It's been so amazing to be in dialogue and be in conversation with one another, even in instances where it's been difficult to end on the same page. But this is what it's all about. This is what the series is about, us having difficult conversations and learning to find one another around issues that society struggles with. But before we go on for today, I'm just going to allow Ilse and Rebekah to introduce themselves before I am implicated in male privilege. And
Hi everyone, my name is Rebekah and I'm so excited to be a part of this, and I'm just part of the Hot Topics team.
Hey everyone, my name is Ilse and it's wonderful to have you joining us tonight from wherever you're watching. We're really excited that you're joining us in this conversation. We really hope that it'll be helpful and that it'll lead to greater understanding and more conversations on this.
Great. Hloni's just looking at me because I was teasing him earlier about being privileged as a male. So I think tonight, before we go on, we wanted to maybe give the why we were having this conversation. As many of you know, or if you've been following along, we were meant to be speaking about white privilege this week. But we felt the need to insert in another week on racism, and actually, Hloni or Ilse, any one of you, can you just give a little bit more of explanation around that?
So we just kind of wanted to help us all get onto the same page. You know, we all have different experiences of race, of privilege, of our own stories, hearing people's stories, and we've picked up that we're not all on the same page, nor do we have to be, but we want to help each other get into the same conversation by having a common understanding of certain terms, understanding certain things about privilege, some myths that we've picked up, and also speaking about racism and what that really means for us as we kind of get ready for our conversation next week on white privilege.
And so that's what we're going to be doing today. Rebekah, Ilse, and I just sat down, just looking at some of the stuff that we've really picked up also, you know, even we're on our own journey towards understanding what privilege is and in conversation with friends. And so I think I'll throw out, so how tonight will actually work is we'll just throw out stuff and then we'll start talking about it. If you have thoughts about it at home, please feel free to share with us. There will be an email address that will appear on our link below. And please feel free to share your thoughts, and even if you've got other stuff that you think might be helpful. So the first one I've come across is around privilege. Does being privileged make me a bad person? Maybe let me rephrase. Does me having unearned privilege make me a bad person?
I think this is definitely something that I've picked up on in since we've started this this conversation. Is lots of people have come to me and been like, Rebekah, we have listened to your talk and we think that we have white privilege. And then my response is, what makes you think that way? They have been in situations that we have described and realized that they have either been a perpetrator, an obvious one, and like displayed white privilege, or subtly. I actually don't know how subtle it can be, but
sure.
Yeah. So and they said, does that make me a bad person? Should I renounce being white? Like how? And obviously you can't do that. But how do I actually go forward? And I think that there is an appropriate amount of guilt to have. Because I definitely have it. I definitely, at times where I have noticed my systemic racism, which is something we'll be getting into later as well, where I have actually covertly, in a covert way, I have had and done things, said things, thought things that would definitely sided with racism, you know? And I just said that it's okay to sit in the uncomfortableness of guilt. It's okay to sit there and be like, well, this is really, it's an intense feeling, it's an overwhelming feeling, but then not staying in that place, but actually moving and realizing being white and having white privilege doesn't make you a bad person, but it's what you do with that privilege at the end of the day. If you just end up harnessing it and being like, well, I've got it anyway, so what does it matter? I think it's problematic. But if you're able to acknowledge your white privilege and be like, I've got this privilege, I want to do something about it. And just quickly, it's just some practical ways to do something about it. I think that it's easy to say you must.
Sure.
I think if you're on social media like myself, or if you have influence, and by influence I don't mean if you have influence on 1,000 people, 2,000 people. I mean your mom, your dad, your brother, your sister, your sibling, your aunt. I'm not saying you must have this massive platform, but when you use your privilege to bring light to the oppression around you, that is a good way to harness your privilege. If your aunt or your uncle's being racist at the table, and you stand up and you say, actually, that is racist, and that's not okay. You know, it's not staying silent in the times when you're actually meant to speak up.
Sure.
I think one of the biggest things around this whole concept of being a bad person, and I think something that you raised, Rebekah, around guilt is, yes, sure, there is guilt, but it shouldn't stop there. You know, you shouldn't just acknowledge your privilege and sit in this pit of guilt and wallow and say, well, cool, I've got privilege. You know, that's all privilege is about, you know, to acknowledge it, but to actually practically do something. And I love the example that you used, you know, being close to home, where it's something that you acknowledge within your own story, within your own space, like at the dinner table when a comment is made. I'm someone who's not a big social media person, and so I think as much as we should be advocates and speak around issues of oppression, it should be true to who you are as well. Otherwise, it just becomes showmanship. And I think it's really important. Yes, awareness is important. But maybe for you, you don't feel like the impact that you can have would be on social media, but it could be around you calling out that person who makes a racist comment, or even shedding light on other forms of oppression and where you are privileged. You know, even around like heterosexual privilege or ableism or things like that. And so it doesn't necessarily make you a bad person, but there's different forms of privilege, and there's systemic and there's structural, and it's not just about you, but sometimes you're part of a system as well.
I think that is so important, what you guys are actually speaking about, you know, to say it doesn't end by by acknowledging the privilege, and at that point where you feel as though, oh snap, I didn't realize I had so much privilege, you know. As a male, I've got privilege, but it's also very important that I do not just pause at that place where I acknowledge my privilege. And I think it actually speaks into the essence of who we are as Christians. You know, we are invited to acknowledge where we need to fix our lives, and then we respond by saying yes to Christ and dying to self. And it's not an easy process, because at times it requires giving up certain things. You know, as a male, acknowledging my privilege means that I need to start calling myself out. I need to renounce some of the unwarranted advantage that I sometimes have over women. I need to acknowledge that in corporate there's a glass ceiling for women, and I need to perhaps break that glass ceiling, and this may come at the expense of me being able to make it up the corporate ladder on women's back, you know?
Yeah, and I also think, Hloni, it's important to realize with this whole white privilege thing, or male guilt, I'm not sure if that's a thing, but there's not deeds that you can do and you'll wake up one day and it's gone.
Absolutely.
So it's not like, okay, I've signed A, B, and C petitions, I have donated so much, I've had these conversations, I've read a book, I've done this. You're not gonna wake up a day and be like, I've done enough work for black people or for females that actually my privilege no longer exists. You know, it's just keeping in mind that it's a never-ending journey. It's a never-ending race, you know. You never get to the end of it, and I know everything I can know about white privilege. I know everything I can know about systemic racism, you know, because it's a new... there's not new ways of racism, but there's new ways of it coming out.
Sure.
Sure. I was just wanting to read something very quickly. Ilse gave us this site, and we're going to link it below for everyone that needs to. We'll have resources for you. On 11 terms you should know better to understand structural racism. And this is one of the terms, individual racism. Individual racism can include face-to-face or covert actions towards a person that intentionally express prejudice, hate, or bias on a race. Racism is intentional. It's not subconscious, and it's such an easy out, do you know what I mean? So that means I need to intentionally not be racist. I need to intentionally be an anti-racist. The same way men need to be intentionally for women. You know, it's not the deeds or the actions, it's the how many deeds or actions. It's actually, I think, the heart and the authenticity behind it.
And I think there's something critical that you mentioned just around privilege. You know, when it comes to how we deal with privilege, you know, do we suddenly one day we wake up and then we no longer have privilege? Do we work hard and help as many female, black people, disabled people as much as we can so that suddenly it feels as though we aren't bad people? You know, I think that's one way to respond, but I do not think that is the most ideal way to respond to our privilege. You know, I think the best thing we can do is actually change the world and create a world where our privilege does not matter anymore, where our unearned privilege is not a factor that determines whether we succeed or not. You know, because it does not help for me as a male to remain in a messianic position where I'm constantly helping women up so that I can feel good about myself. And because that's sometimes how we want to respond. But instead, what I'm meant to do is I'm meant to transform society so that women don't even need me in order to succeed.
I love what you raised on that, Hloni, and that's maybe going to bring us to our second myth today, around this doing and being in this position where you have to help others. Because I've often come across this thing when we speak about privilege, the first response from a lot of people is, instead of just speaking about, or instead of them, which refers to a specific group that's oppressed and is a victim to this privilege, why don't they just do something? So instead of just speaking about it, why don't they just do something? And I think that's the essence of privilege, is the fact that because you belong to a certain group, so for me, because I belong to the white group, because I'm white, I have certain privileges which are unearned benefits, advantages that I have, not because I've specifically done something, that no matter how hard that other person, no matter how hard they work, they'll never be able to get everything that I have. They'll never have the same opportunities that I have, regardless of how hard they work. And so I think that's the big thing is for me that I realized is it's not just about saying, get up, help yourself. It's, I can try to help myself, but there's certain things I will never be able to do because of privilege.
Hloni, I think this is a great way. Before we started, we wanted to speak a little bit on the Black Lives Movement and the significance and importance of it. And I think that's exactly what your point speaks to, you know, is that it's not just to say that the Black Lives Matter movement exists, or to, as like a white person, to share about it or speak about it. It's actually it's a focus. It's not. Hloni, can you maybe speak a little bit about what we were saying earlier?
So I think it's what we wanted to highlight is that when it comes to Black Lives Movement, it is not to say that we are suddenly saying that everyone else does not matter, you know. We are instead choosing to pause. I listened to a speaker 2 weeks ago who was speaking about the importance of pausing and learning how to mourn in every moment. You know, when we mourn today, today while we record, one of the things that happened in South Africa is that there's a young woman who was murdered. And today the country chooses to pause and acknowledge that her life matters. We choose to say, young man, stop this femicide and value woman. It is not to say that young men suddenly do not matter. It is not to say that they are not important, but we are intentionally choosing to pause and acknowledge that there are lives that are taken for granted and that are constantly being victims of murder and other forms of violence. And that's exactly what the Black Lives Matter, BLM movement seeks to highlight, that at this moment, after the passing of Floyd, we're going to pause and say, Black Lives Matter, this has to come to an end. Not that everyone else does not matter, but we are choosing to mourn.
And I think even that's a very biblical principle, is being a voice to the voiceless. And that's often, although it might not be something that we constantly are confronted with depending on our society, often black lives don't have the voices that white lives would, or the seriousness that white lives, if they were to say something, white people, when they say something, often there's the people that listen to it. But when a black person says something, it might not be as listened to. And so this BLM movement is being the voice to the voiceless, a very biblical principle.
And I think, I just wanted to highlight something, Ilse, when Ilse spoke about the whole idea of saying, why don't they just get up and work, And I think it also kind of borders on another myth, that when we speak about privilege, we're overlooking the efforts that people have put into being successful. And that is not the case. But instead, what privilege teaches us is that there is an added advantage that's enabled you to realize the fruits of your effort. And there is someone out there who could do the same, but because they do not have this added advantage that you have by virtue of your skin color or your gender, by accident of birth, then unfortunately, they cannot do the same. So one, privilege does not say that people are not working. When we say you're privileged, it does not mean that you have not worked in order to get that far in life. But all it means is that there's an added advantage that's enabled you to recognize the fruits of your work. And there's someone who could do the same work, but because of their race, their gender, their sexuality, or any other feature, any other characteristics, they would not be in the same position regardless of how much they work.
Yeah, and I think that I want to just look at Luke 6. Hloni actually used this as an example the other day. Some of you may know Carl Lentz, but he gave a sermon on Blessed are the poor. Sure. And it's Luke 6, verse 20 to 21, and he says, looking at his disciples, he said, Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. He's not saying only are the poor blessed. Only are the hungry blessed, He's focusing on, Jesus is focusing on a group. He's focusing on an oppressed and marginalized grouping of people. And he's saying, for such a time as this, for this timing in history, blessed are the poor. For this time in history, blessed are the hungry. Okay, and the other day I read something that, so on Instagram, I'll caption something like, blessed with the best, or, wow, God really blessed me with this opportunity. A year ago, I got the opportunity to go live and work in London, and I just felt blessed. When the praises go up, the blessings come down, But actually, is it because I'm white? Like, am I blessed? Is it a blessing or is it privilege? I have no doubt that God blesses people. Don't get me wrong. Financially, generally, I do believe that there is such thing as blessing aside from privilege. But how much in my life have I had a conversation with someone and be like, you know what, I'm just blessed. Or gotten a job interview, I'm just blessed. Or I have been given something, no, I'm just blessed. I've been thinking to myself recently, do I need to look back and be like, wow.
Sure.
This is because I'm privileged, not because I'm blessed. Sure. And I think more often than not, it's because I'm privileged. And I can give you examples where I've been blessed, and not because of my skin color, okay? And I have been blessed. I can't give an example right now because everything that's coming to me is privilege. But more often, I'm privileged than blessed.
I want to ask a question then. Do you believe that we can use the privilege we have in order to bless others?
Yes, and that is what we should be doing. That was my point earlier, is that the whole purpose of there's no purpose in privilege. There is no purpose in privilege if you look at it as just privilege. There's purpose in privilege when you're using it in the right way. And I'm not saying this means you go, you have food, you have a photo opportunity with the person you're giving food with. Using my privilege for the best, do you know what I mean? It intentionally every day. It's not once a month thing. It's intentionally every day. What can I do today? And not as a white savior, not being, how am I going to help a black person today?
Look, I'd say transform the world with your privilege. Transform the world with your privilege. There's a beautiful saying, one of my favorite activists, Olas Kosane, says, it is said that he quotes the Chinese proverb, which says, give a man a fish, feed him for a day, teach him how to fish, feed him for a lifetime. But he says, go on a step further than that and help him access pools from which he can fish. And so I would say, with our privilege, let's actually enable people. Jesus does not walk around using his privilege as an abled person who can participate in the economy to fill the beggar's cups, whatever it might have been. He doesn't go around doing that, but instead he enabled the beggar. That's what he does. Jesus does not go around saying, great, women are now in proximity to me, and so they are liberated. They are benefiting from my privilege as a male rabbi, since I'm the only one who can be a rabbi around here. But he gives women a voice. As a result, women are the first to announce the gospel. Use your privilege to enable. And the challenge with that, the reason most of us will probably struggle with this, and it's a beautiful struggle because the Bible journey is about taking up a cross, man. You know, the reason many of us will struggle with this is because it requires being in the margins. First of all, it requires learning how to keep quiet and listen to the cry of those who are marginalized so that you can learn what it is that they need and that you do not assume. I can't assume for women. I need to take the lead from women as far as using my privilege to transform society for the benefit of women. So sitting in the margins, listening amidst that noise, going to that protest and learning to listen to what the whisper is in that protest. Sitting in the center and taking your lead from those who are marginalized, not to be their savior, but to transform the world so that it can be a better world for everyone.
Yeah, and I think, Hloni, what has been bugging me so much this week, and this might be quite offensive, but I think we're beyond that now, is that the church chooses to remain silent and has chosen to remain silent for so long on privilege, on white privilege, on racism, on femicide, on the fact that I've gone to churches, there's no wheelchair ramps. I go to churches, there's no signer. So I'm not saying that this is, if we look at, so we have Black Lives Matter. That is a focus and an issue within itself, and it deserves all the attention it gets. If we look at all other privileges that we have, they're not even looked at. At some churches, they're not even addressed. And the church is meant to influence the world. So how are we meant to influence the world when we can't even influence our congregation members? When we can't influence people within our own four walls? And that's where I must give Gracepoint, where I felt like at Gracepoint, we've been given the stage and the time and the efforts. We have people who are here today who could be doing anything else, and we've been given this opportunity. But I think that my whole point about the Bible and about the church too often has been on the wrong side of history when it has come to Black lives, when it has come to women, when it has come to gay people, to the LGBTQI community. We have been on the wrong side of history for too long. And I think there is a call and there's something happening where that's no longer okay. You know, the Bible for too many times has been used for a tool of oppression. And I think something is shifting now. And there's something shifting in the church. Young people are going, I don't want silence anymore, you know. And you're right, Jesus spoke up against ableism, against people walking past the blind man. Jesus speaks against people who are about to stone a woman caught in adultery. You know, and I think that, I don't know what my point was, but there was a point. My point is
the church must be on the right side of history.
The church must be on the right side of history. And I think this is not just Gracepoint. I think this is the beginning of the church being on the right side of history. But we've got to remember that there's still churches that are definitely far behind us, you know?
And I think it's a big thing about privilege is there's a lack of awareness, except in certain spaces. You know, we've started having this conversation and my eyes have just been opened. You know, I wake up in the morning now and I think about my privilege, where it was something that I never, ever, not never, ever, but I didn't think about as often as I do now. You know, you see little things and you're like, but that's because of my privilege. And I think it's an awareness and it's an intentionality in thinking about things in a different way, seeing things in a different way, listening to people's stories in a different way, and acting in a different way. It's not just about knowing the right things, but it's about changing our behaviors.
And I think that's where we're going to leave it for today. But before we conclude, we're just going to allow for a round of, maybe for some stuff that you think might be helpful for people who are on the same journey. I think let's take it. We'll start. We'll head it straight to Rebekah.
There is a gremlin in my laptop. It is just frozen with all my notes. But actually, I don't really need it. I just have something to say. I think that men are lucky in many ways. But just as we touched on the whole woman thing, just for a second, because we are looking at general privileges, I think men are lucky that women are asking for equality and not revenge. I think white people are privileged that black people are looking for equality and not revenge. Because that and as a Christian, of course, I'm not meant to say that revenge in any way is good. But I think that we as white people have been let off very lightly in this whole movement. And I just want to make that clear. I'm speaking for myself. That I am miles and miles and miles and quadrillion miles away from ever being woke on this. And I think that's the thing, is that wokeness seems to be the end result. And I don't want to get to a point where I'm completely woke on this. And I never will get to a point when I am completely woke on this situation. But I think that's what I just wanted to highlight, is that we are lucky that we are able to, that there is integration and there is all of us being together. But at the church I was in last year, they have this quote that says, "There's only unity in diversity." That we cannot be united unless we're diverse. And I think that is the call. Men, women, able people, heterosexual people, people who are citizens of South Africa and not. There needs to be diversity. Done.
Ilse, on your side?
I don't think there's much to add from my side from this conversation, apart from it's really exciting to be part of these conversations. It can be quite nerve-wracking, and I think as someone, if you're at home and you're feeling like you don't know nearly enough about this, or you don't feel like you even know about this, know that it's just come along for the journey. You don't have to have an opinion right now, but come along for the journey. Listen with all your might and all your strength and all your mind and all your heart, and see what God does in this space.
And I think before Rebekah concludes for us, I think from my side, I just really want to say we look forward to the journey. We're going to be having a couple of guests that are going to be joining us on set to help us explore some of these topics. Really exciting guests. And so please do join us. And we still have our Tuesday Bible studies that will be taking place. We've got our Monday book Club Light. Did I get it right?
Yeah, you did.
Yes, we've got our Monday Book Club Light, and then we've got our conversations on Tuesday, which help us unpack all of this further. But from me, just before Rebekah signs us out with a prayer, I just want to say, man, privilege is so deep that we have the privilege to engage about privilege. Let that sink. We have the privilege to be philosophical around hunger.
Yeah, it's a privilege to only learn about privilege and not to experience it. And yeah. So let's end on that. Let's pray. God, I thank you so much that you would be found in the margins. That you call out people who believe that they are above other people. God, I thank you that you are in these conversations, Lord. I thank you so much that you are here and you are with everyone who's at home. God, I pray that there's a move of your Spirit. That if there's any offense in tonight's video, God, that you would inspect our hearts. You would inspect our intentions. God, we know that we are fallen and we are imperfect people. But God, I pray that you open our eyes. You allow the scales to fall from our eyes where our privilege has blinded us. That we're not led by feelings, that we're not led by emotions, because we know that those are fleeting. But we are led by you. So God, as we go on this journey, Lord, I pray for grace for each and every one of us. When we are about to get offended or we're about to disagree, God, I pray that there's grace for us and grace for everyone. That we're able to have good, healthy conversations around this, Lord. But God, I know you also call us to stand up for what is right. So God, I pray that you help us discern when those moments are. We pray this in your name. Amen. We'll see you Tuesday evening for Hot Topics or Monday.